We've discussed in previous lectures the middle class, and it's necessary now to take a moment to investigate exactly what that class was and how it developed in the 19th century to reflect some of the dominant ideas and conform to some of the most dramatic ideologies of that century. The middle class had existed long before industrialization, but it had prospered from it enormously, becoming increasingly influential in European society, the economy, and government. And by the mid-19th century, it's usual to talk about classes rather than the more traditional orders or estates. When we talked about the Middle Ages or the Ancien Régime, for example, we talked about those estates that had defined a person's place in society. But these barriers had broken down, and social mobility, to some extent precipitated by the French Revolution and certainly encouraged by the Industrial Revolution, allowed for a different kind of definition of where an individual or a group fit in society. Advancement was increasingly based on merit, on education, on skills, and on service. And this was now possible through much of European society. There were, of course, remnants of the old regimes, those that tried to impede this mobility and maintain social and political privileges based on birth. And of course, you can't generalize about any class. There are always subdivisions within each group. There are upper and lower, urban, rural, industrial, financial, managerial. All of these things help determine the subcategories of any group within the middle class. But nevertheless, what we will see is that there developed an awareness of certain shared values that transcended the traditional marker that had existed almost from the beginning of European civilization, birth. The class identification was based on a great many elements: manner of dress, accent, style of life, adherence to a political party, so many other things, the neighborhood in which you lived. In Europe, to some extent to this day, people can place you socially by the way you speak. And 19th century classes weren't singular constructs, and they varied with geography. They did not hold the same beliefs everywhere. And moreover, each one of them had its own examples of outliers, radicals, who in fact did not represent their own particular social group, but rather identified with another. For example, many of the most radical thinkers were middle-class privileged intellectuals, such as Karl Marx. Some were even great aristocrats, like the Count of Saint-Simon, whom we will meet later, who became the evangelist of utopian socialism. Nevertheless, there were strong defining characteristics of a middle class, and these must be recognized so that we can talk about the class with some measure of confidence. It was a property-owning class, entrepreneurial, interested in the acquisition of capital, and anxious to improve itself through education. It was composed of professionals, those that formed the official bureaucracy, those that formed the intelligentsia, the lawyers and the journalists and the professors of almost every state on the continent. It produced the managers of businesses, large and small. And politically, it favored reform so that they could reach their collective aspirations. This consisted of the right to vote and access to political office. The middle class sought liberty and social harmony as the keys to progress, and they were committed to modernization, seeing progress and science and knowledge as part of their worldview. The French revolutionary ideas then of liberty, equality, fraternity were in some ways very reflective of the ambitions of this class in the subsequent century. And in fact, interestingly, in France, the bourgeoisie saw the revolution as its own particular moment. They then began to enshrine these events as part of their own culture and turn them into national holidays and things to be celebrated. The Reign of Terror, of course, was quickly forgotten. Outside of France, the situation was different and more complicated, because there often nationalism joined with liberalism among the middle classes, especially in countries that were not united, like Italy and Germany. And it was middle-class liberalism and nationalism that really gave the impetus to the nationalist movements of the 1850s and 60s. In Germany, the industrial elites that emerged from German industrialization in the 1840s showed sympathy with the conservative aristocratic elite, at least in terms of culture and values, if not politics. They too were educated not just in chemistry, but also often in the law and in philology, so they could quote Homer and Virgil, as well as they could quote Samuel Smiles. But they still politically agitated against absolutism. They called for an end of the privileges of the aristocracy, even if they liked to speak like them, and like their middle-class brethren in Britain and France, demanded a middle-class voice in government. The culture and attitudes of the middle class in Western Europe and society in general were really defined by a moment that we still refer to and that still has resonance today. And that is the Victorian era, the Britain of Queen Victoria, who became queen in the first decades of the 19th century in 1837 and then ruled for an extraordinary 64 years until her death in 1901, into the century just past. This was a period of dramatic, major, fundamental social change. And by the 1860s and 70s, the middle class had come to believe that it was the soul of Britain. Its values were Britain's values. These values were respectability, high moral principle, and they became models. They became the models particularly in the case of women. Now, this too is an interesting phenomenon, in part perhaps because England was ruled by a queen. But the role of women in industrial society in 19th century Britain began to change the character of industrial culture itself. Women came to dominate the domestic sphere. They were, in their own terms, the angel of the house. They employed domestic servants, but they also played the role of loving wife, domestic guardian of morality, protector of children, social hostess. She came to control the sphere of the home, while more and more men left the home to work in businesses and factories. This was the separation of power to some extent, where women were left with control of the domestic sphere because men no longer inhabited it. They now worked outside the home. They went to work. They took the street railway to the office, to the counting house, and they left the women at home with children in order to define those social values that came to characterize Victorian Europe. Unlike working class women, middle class women did not need to work, and the consequent social role of women in the family would necessarily change dramatically. So this separation of power, these separate spheres of public and private, solidified. The private became the domain of women alone, and that created a culture of domesticity. This is illustrated in one of the most interesting and one of the most popular books of the entire 19th century in the English language. And that's Harriet Beeton's The Book of Household Management, which went through dozens of editions, but the ones that she oversaw between 1859 and 1861 are considered the core of this enormous book of advice and recipes and cleaning methods and almost everything else that one would expect in a large Victorian household. It's worth noting, I think, that my wife's mother, who's English, gave my wife a copy of Mrs. Beeton on the occasion of our marriage in the early 1970s. The book had very long reach, and it was understood that this is how a household was to be managed. The fact that the book was over 100 years old at the time was irrelevant, that in some eyes the world really never changes. Women ran the household, and households became increasingly complex. And these were, in part, the same sorts of factors that were driving the expansion of the factories and the industrial system. More and more middle-class households employed domestic staff. As girls came from the countryside where there was insufficient work in the domestic industries of spinning and weaving, and chose domestic work in the cities over the factory. The middle class, moreover, needed these servants because they took great pride in their homes. Why? Why was there this idea of the angel of the house, the home being this most important place where each man had the right of a lord of a castle? Well, because the residents of the middle class reflected their social status, their taste, their culture, and their success. This is really a critical point because we're talking of a world of rapid and broad social mobility. How did you advertise your position in society? Well, today it's buying a certain kind of car or eating in a certain restaurant with some regularity. In the 19th century, it was where you lived and how you furnished your house and how you dressed. So social mobility then was recognized with caste marks, that is, outward and visible signs of gentility, of success, of surplus wealth that allowed you to buy things you didn't need, the employing of domestic servants, having houses too large for your family but nevertheless required by your status. Lifestyles then began to reflect the gentility of the elite, but without the aristocratic conspicuous consumption that now had an aura of wasteful prodigality. Where once the aristocracy was the model and they were aped in all things, now there is an element to be avoided. And this again comes to some extent from that Reformed religion sobriety, that you used what it is that was most appropriate, the utilitarianism of so many of the 18th century thinkers. Do what was good, do what was useful, do what was appropriate, but don't waste, don't show off for the sake of showing off. Just indicate a sense of appropriateness, a sense of decorum. Decorum being one of the great 19th century terms of social acceptability. The home then became the center of a cult of respectability. A good and stable home, well-educated and obedient children were signs of not only respectability, but an ordered, well-managed life in society. It's interesting to think of Mrs. Beeton's book. Mrs. Beeton's model, like so many other 19th century books of advice, used a military example. In the household, the wife and mother was the general or the admiral. The servants were the foot soldiers in the trenches who did what needed to be done. The children were the subalterns. They were to learn obedience, the skill set that ultimately would allow them to be the masters of their own homes in the fullness of time. They were to learn respect and practice it so that aura of respectability could be unbroken. It wasn't enough, said Mrs. Beeton, to have a cook. It was assumed you had a cook. The wife must also know the recipes, the quantities, the requirements, just as well as the cook to ensure quality and success. Similarly, the upper parlor maid has to be observed. The wife, the angel of the house, must be absolutely certain that the grates are cleaned at night and that the grates are loaded with fresh coal by 5 the next morning to make sure the house is warm by the time the father and the children arise. There's a sense of responsibility, a sense of labor, a sense of earned respect based upon the fulfillment of the series of expectations. Moreover, the Victorian household reflected status and reflected wealth and reflected refinement by the things that they collected. An overly furnished, very highly decorated home with silver for the table, silver in profusion. If you've inherited your grandmother's asparagus holder or Stilton slicer or 7 shapes of sorbet spoons or pickle forks, you realize that the silver was spread across the table not because these things are particularly useful, but because they indicate status. You knew which one to use. You owned it. It was silver. So the dressing of a table became almost as important as the dressing of a body, because as you invited those who were to be admitted into your refined and civilized but protected environment, you were able to indicate quite clearly and immediately your status and your wealth. Similarly, you had a library that was full of books. Whether the books were read really was irrelevant, but the books had to be there because you were the keeper of civilization, of knowledge, of culture, of wisdom. You had to pass these on to your children. So you had to advertise the fact. Class was defined then in the middle class in the 19th century, not so much by income, but by possessions, by style of life, by attitudes. This was the outward and visible sign of social mobility, because it's not wealth but deportment that really matters. And because of their numbers and influence, these attitudes and perspectives increasingly defined the shared values of society as a whole. We're not just then talking about one class. We're talking about a class that was beginning to define itself as the dominant class, and a dominant class in many ways, morally, increasingly, as we'll see, politically, socially, economically. And any group that has similar self-definitions and will begin to create those elements that will allow those things to be learned and spread to others and identified by those who are both within and without. Popular magazines began to appear, with indications of how a house should be decorated, how you should dress. Newspapers and journals arose about what opinions you should hold if you're a member of the middle class, what party you should vote for in politics, what was the most fashionable play. All of these things then were part of the broad extension of middle-class values that came about through the expansion of the written word and the publishing industry, especially the cheap periodical press. And increasingly, the aristocracy was identified almost negatively. When the gossip sheets, the hello magazines of the 19th century were spread, who was being gossiped about? The aristocracy, because they were idle, they were wasteful, and in some instances even degenerate. One just has to look at John Galsworthy's statement in the Forsyte Saga, where Soames Forsyte has a negative opinion of the suitor of his daughter Fleur, Michael Mount, because he's of the nobility. And he remarks that Michael's father doesn't earn his own income. He, in fact, is a kind of social parasite because he doesn't work. He's a noble, he owns property, but that isn't sufficient. Soames Forsyte was, in fact, the soul of the bourgeoisie. To be a member of society meant to work, to contribute, to have responsibilities, and to have values. And those that didn't fit that, including those above as well as those below, somehow were outside this increasingly narrow and exclusive perspective. But as the aristocracy was being recognized perhaps as having values that were in contradistinction to those of the middle class, the aristocracy still enjoyed respect. They were, after all, living history. They carried great names, and they were the ones who made up the upper house, at least in England, and in France during the 19th century, the House of Peers. Those below, the poor, they were excluded as well. They were the ones, as we've seen, who were victimized. They were drunken, they were immoral, they were shiftless, they were dishonest, they were untrustworthy, and consequently, they were the cause of their own misfortune. If the home advertised status and respectability, then your portable caste marks, your dress, became a mobile social marker just as much as deportment and possessions. And we have to remember our earlier discussion of the early years of the Industrial Revolution. The factory system applied to textile industry had made ready-made, good quality clothing extremely cheap. So poor people were able to dress the way in the 17th or 16th century only wealthy people could dress. So it wasn't really the way that the clothes actually looked. There had to be some other indicator that was determining status in the way you dressed. So the middle class separated themselves out by dressing extravagantly. And by that, I don't mean with the sort of 18th century ancien regime ships in your hair and great ruffs and complicated clothing. Not at all. But rather the fact that a Victorian lady of the middle class had to change her clothes 4 or 5 times a day. When you walk into a costume museum, what do you see? Ladies' morning dress, ladies' walking dress, ladies' traveling dress, ladies' afternoon dress, ladies' evening dress, and dozens of others. The expectation was that you spent a good deal of your time doing nothing except changing your clothes. And the assumptions were A, you had the clothes to change into, B, you had somebody to help you do it because it was almost impossible to dress in these clothes by yourself, and C, that there was a reason for doing it. Not just you wanted to show you had it, but there was a reason. Thorstein Veblen, in his Theory of the Leisure Class, which was printed in 1899, although he is writing in America, it reflects Europe, developed the idea of conspicuous consumption. Women's dress in the 19th century made it difficult, if not impossible, to work. The bustles, the pinched waists, the high collars, the heavy materials, all of these things were actually designed to hobble movement. because women dressed in this manner were markedly rich. They were supported by rich husbands, rich fathers. They didn't need to work, and they advertised the fact simply by wearing clothes that made it impossible for them to do so. Similarly with men, you have in the 19th century the emergence of the business suit, significantly named, not accidental, starched collars, the bowler hat, carrying the umbrella. These became costumes, class costumes. Indeed, if you see pictures not just from the end of the 19th century, but of the City of London today, you see men walking to the counting houses and banks and insurance companies wearing bowler hats, identical black coats, carrying umbrellas. This was a sign that they were members of the middle class. They were celebrating their class allegiance, and they were indicating that they were different. Similarly, if you look at pictures from the 19th century, you'll see on the other side of the street men in cloth caps who with scarves around their necks, without ties, with no starched collars. These were members of the working class. They too had their costume, and by their costume shall ye know them. England had become, by the middle of the 19th century, the greatest economic and imperial power on earth. It was the greatest power since ancient Rome. It was the greatest producer of goods that the world had ever seen. And this proliferation of goods and services designed for middle-class consumers and made known in the market increase through advertising, which is a 19th century invention of industrial society, meant that this consumer culture, this middle-class collection of things to indicate status, was sought after not just by members of that class in one place, but almost everywhere. The ads in the magazines printed in Britain and then later in Paris and later in Berlin and later in Milan popularized middle-class culture, but most of them were profoundly dependent upon British middle-class culture. And on the continent, the proliferation of publications directed towards the local, indigenous, continental consumer class derived from this idea of collective middle-class taste. The British were the first to get there. The British developed this concept of middle-class identification and middle-class caste marks earlier than anyone else. And so to some extent, they began to define that culture. So not just on the continent, but in the colonies of the British Empire, these things were adopted. In North America, in Australia, and curiously and strangely, this same middle-class culture, these values of respectability and values of dress and deportment were brought by British and continental missionaries to Africa, to Asia, to India. Everywhere that these missionaries went and where middle-class European culture spread through magazines and periodicals and through the traveling of individuals, middle-class culture was identified with and celebrated as progressive, modern, enlightened. If you wanted to be modern, you were middle class and you dressed in a particular way and acted in a particular way. It's for this reason you see those clones of British public schools, and of course there are private schools, arising not just in the former British Empire, in India and in Canada and New Zealand, but in places like Argentina, where in fact you wanted to be part of this elite, and the only way you could do it was to pretend you were something that you were not by acting in a particular way. And education was the instrument by which this was most easily achieved. Britain ruled the greatest empire in the world, but it was through its middle-class culture that real power, to some extent, and real recognition was spread. The most successful example of cultural imperialism since ancient Rome was in fact British middle-class culture of the 19th century, because it infected not only the entire continent of Europe, but much of the world. If you look at 19th century photographs, you see Chinese, Japanese, Indian, South Americans dressed like middle-class Englishmen. There's an interesting story in Giuseppe di Lampedusa's, the great author of Il Gattopardo, the leopard, about his father. His father was an Italian diplomat who was transferred to London. And before he was to move there, he went to his tailor with English magazines and had an entire new wardrobe of clothes prepared. And as he was settling into his house, his servant ran up to him and said, "Sir, I think we have a problem." And he said, "What is this?" He said, "You are the only person who is dressed like an Englishman." In other words, this English middle-class culture had reached to Sicily, where the Lampedusas were from, and it had reached them at a time when they were looking at an example as a model as opposed to a reality. Culture then became an extraordinarily powerful export of middle-class Europe, and it was a dynamic and a dramatic one. Well, middle-class society and culture wasn't just its own self-referential moment of self-knowledge and self-identification. There was a political aspect as well, an important concomitant element that was increasingly influential. Where industrialization was most widespread and the educated middle class emerged, there were the most powerful demands for broader franchise, legal equality of all citizens, and freer trade. These things, of course, coalesced into what we will see in a subsequent lecture as the liberal parties of Europe, often associated with nationalist associations that then saw freedom to be both economic and political. Well, this was obvious from the center of Europe, from the major Western European nations that adopted so many of these industrial attitudes that came out of this new dynamic middle class. But what about the peripheral areas? Can we generalize about Europe, or must we only talk about industrial Europe? There were, in fact, differences in culture, and those areas that were the least industrialized felt that this culture was to some extent still desirable, and they still wanted to be part of it, but they didn't have the mechanism to actually share it. The Ottoman Empire in Russia, for example. And we must remember that the Ottoman Empire controlled vast territories in the Balkans and southeastern Europe until the 20th century. Here in Russia and the Ottoman Empire, the middle classes were largely dependent on the state. They were the bureaucrats, small in number, little political influence. And in these areas where there was no constitutional government and repressive autocracy was the character of the state, the only way to exercise and to identify their culture was in fact through these superficial elements, essentially of dress and to some extent of education. So the culture of the middle class was, to a degree, the culture of the elite everywhere. It was the culture of the elite even in those areas where the middle class did not enjoy the same political and economic and social opportunities or advantages. But still, because of popular journalism, because of periodicals, and because of this identification with middle-class action and deportment, with progress and modernity, it still was adopted as a kind of uniform. A direct correlation between liberal principles and an independent, progressive, educated, and economically advantaged middle class then developed. This became a powerful, powerful stimulus for change. And on the continent, particularly in Germany and parts of the Habsburg Empire and in Italy, there were closer identifications between the traditional elites and the growing middle class. Why? One would not think that there would be this natural acceptance, but why? Nationalism brought together enlightened and liberal nobles and articulate professionals such as lawyers and journalists on the issue of national self-determination. National self-determination overshadowed their differing economic and social interests. This was especially true in Italy and in Austria. Industrialization came late and tended to be confined to particular regions, making the idea of a national middle-class culture very, very difficult to identify. The values of the traditional society then, the inherited elitist perspective of a classical education rather than a business or technical education, subsequently endured on the continent. The ability to quote Virgil or Goethe mattered more than skill at management. And the continued adherence of more conservative areas of Europe in Catholic countries indicated the not repressive, but certainly the conservative influences of the Church and the syllabus of errors. Nevertheless, as we shall see, some of these same tensions, the class tensions that were evident in France and Britain, began to explode on the fringes of Western Europe as well, driving demand for representative assemblies, freer trade, liberal policies, so that the ideas that we've been discussing that define the middle class moved beyond just those areas where they had the deepest roots, the consequence of industrialization, and move then to the fringes of Europe as well, where liberalism became the ideology of the middle class, and liberalism also became the instrument by which not only national self-determination would be determined, but then also that progress and change would take place. The middle class then had a broad reach and a broad perspective, and it created in many ways the culture and the society of 19th century Europe, wherever you may look.